Hey everybody, it's Andrea again. What happens if everyone else around you is freaking out because potentially a Roe v. Wade opponent is going to be appointed to the Supreme Court? How does the Supreme Court actually work? What other kinds of things should we be concerned about? So I want to make some commentary today on the situation with this Trump appointee, or nominee, I should say, to the Supreme Court by the name of Brett Kavanaugh. First off, I should say that there are legitimate reasons to be concerned about this person, and I kind of want to run down real quick why I say that. But I also later want to temper it with some other food for thought. Today was the first day of hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, in which this committee will determine whether or not to forward this nominee for approval to the full body of the Senate. This particular committee, the majority of which and the leadership of which are Republicans, because of course they hold the majority in the Senate. But their job will be to vote on whether or not to forward this nominee to the full body of the Senate. Right now, those votes are hinging on a couple of the Republican senators, Susan Collins from Maine, Murkowski from Alaska, who both have expressed pro-choice views and have actually said in the past that Roe v. Wade in particular is settled law, and that's kind of the test that they're going to be looking at as they look these SCOTUS appointees. So Brett Kavanaugh's hearings today were really set off by a lot of discord and really long and lengthy sort of statements from the senators that are serving on this committee. There were arrests made, a lot of protests, and this sort of thing. There's some procedural motions coming from the Senate, and presumably from the Democrat side, in which they're kind of slowing things up a little bit to kind of drag this out. The pretense being, well, he needs more scrutiny, there's more documents. Now, Kavanaugh has held a couple of roles that are pretty significant. Number one was he was the White House counsel under Bush II. And then more recently, he served as one of the judges on the three-member D.C. District Court. Not all that long ago, there was a decision and a case that was presented to that district court. Long story short is that there was an undocumented teen who was being held in immigration detention who requested an abortion. She figured out while she was in detention that she was like 8 weeks pregnant. There is law in Texas that allows, I think it's 20 weeks in which a person can have an abortion. And she had the money. She was definitely of age of consent, that sort of thing. And the ACLU represented her to the federal district court because the immigration detention would not allow her to have an abortion. And while Kavanaugh was not voicing an outright negative opinion about whether or not she should have an abortion, what he really was trying to do was come up with these kind of procedural hearings and things of this nature that would have ended up slowing down the clock for her, and then she would not have been able to have an abortion under Texas law. Eventually, this district court did allow the young woman to have the abortion. That's kind of noteworthy. So even though he did try to muck up the works a little bit, eventually she was allowed to have the abortion. She had the abortion. Then the case was escalated to Supreme Court, but that's a spoiler that I'm not going to reveal right now. It's this issue of whether or not he understands the concept of settled law. So I want to kind of talk about Roe v. Wade a little bit. Of course, this is the landmark Supreme Court ruling that upheld a woman's right to have an abortion. The basis of Roe v. Wade was privacy. And even though the Constitution doesn't explicitly say people have the right to privacy, what the Supreme Court decided at that time was that it basically does uphold the right to privacy, especially regarding the right to be protected against illegal search and seizures and to be safe in your home and in your papers. So the Supreme Court at that time felt that privacy really was kind of at least inferred in the Constitution, and that's the basis of which Roe v. Wade was approved. That's been upheld. Many people feel like that's settled law. Of course, many senators feel like that's settled law. And it's not normally the course of business for the Supreme Court to kind of reach in and just pull out an arbitrary ruling and decide that they're going to try it again. Further, there was a case In 1991, it was Planned Parenthood of Southeast Pennsylvania versus Casey, who was the governor of Pennsylvania at that time. And the legislature created new rules for abortion. One had to do with notification of a minor to their parent. One placed a 24-hour hold before a woman could actually have an abortion. And then the third was that there were notification requirements for a woman to have to tell her husband. So this case was heard in the Supreme Court in 1991, and it was a split decision, 5-4, but the Supreme Court upheld the other parts, the other requirements, and essentially upheld Roe v. Wade, but what they didn't uphold was this issue of whether or not a woman has to tell her husband. And so they said basically that those were Pennsylvania's legislature created reasonable measures, reasonable controls for how people can have abortion. They absolutely upheld Roe v. Wade, right? So the way the Supreme Court works, there is a tendency in the Supreme Court right now to respect established rulings, established laws. In order for someone like Kavanaugh to overturn Roe v. Wade, he would first have to overturn Planned Parenthood versus the state of Pennsylvania and the governor of Pennsylvania, that ruling from 1991. That's not really an easy thing to do. So you would have to overturn that ruling and then go after Roe v. Wade, number one. Number two, it's really important to keep in mind that the Supreme Court deals with law, with established law. Another way that they might be able to attack Roe v. Wade would be if a significant number of states would declare abortion outright illegal in their states, and it would have to be a significant number. What the court has not been sensitive to is outright vetoes. Now, they will temper rights, and we can have issues about that, but they don't support outright vetoes. The other thing that's important is that the Supreme Court responds to what happens in the lower federal district courts. So if there's a case in the lower district courts, and if there's enough merit, that case can be elevated to the Supreme Court. Here's the thing. 4 Supreme Court judges have to be willing to hear that case. And then there has to be a majority decision, and then 5 out of the 9 would have to agree to overturn a decision or to rule in some way that impacts the decision in order for it to be binding for the lower federal courts. Now, I want to point out politics here, because the way that lower district federal court judges get appointed is, again, that the president nominates them and the Senate decides if they're going to approve them or not. So there were 15 different federal court nominees that Trump just approved, and the Democratic senators, instead of creating a hue and cry and using procedural motions to slow them down, they just kind of blanket said, yeah, sure, whatever. We want to go home for vacation in August. So they just outright went ahead and approved all of those 15 court judges. And remember, one of the ways that cases get heard in the Supreme Court is that there has to be a decision that was made by a lower district court. So we have Democratic senators that approved a whole bunch of judges that may or may not be soft on Roe v. Wade, right? So there's that. I would posit that instead of freaking out about Kavanaugh, because of the way that the Supreme Court works, it's not just an easy thing to go in and attack Roe v. Wade, because too many people see that as established law. Even Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, even says that he sees it as established law, right? The part that we're missing is that we're kind of abdicating our own personal responsibility as regards the politics in our states, and in the people that we have elected to represent us in the Senate when it comes to approving these judges, right? Supreme Court responds to law. It doesn't find fact. So you actually have to have a state law that says X, Y, Z. In this case, we outlaw abortion outright, right? That's the kind of thing that the Supreme Court is going to respond to. And so what that does is kick back the responsibility of whether or not there is such a law back to state legislatures. And how do people get into the state legislature? They get elected. And so for us to kind of freak out about Kavanaugh, and I don't want to downplay the quote unquote danger, right? I don't believe that the danger really exists, but his personal politics and his track record suggest that there is some concern there about other rulings, right? So if we're concerned, we have to make sure that the people that we're putting into our state legislatures actually have a consciousness that we're okay with, so that they don't create these legal situations in which we contest state law in federal district court and then therefore maybe get it to the Supreme Court. So that's on us, right? The other thing is this overriding question of whether or not a woman has a right to choose. And I certainly uphold that right to choose, right? My feminism requires that I uphold that right to choose. The thing of it is that I expand my concept of feminism, and I go beyond the traditional hard stop of second wave feminism. I go beyond that because we have to be honest about the fact that right now there is a de facto prohibition on abortion for women of the working class. And what I find really interesting is that nobody wants to talk about whether or not women can afford to have abortion. Even more interesting is the point that Supreme Court just ruled on this case called Janus, which essentially says that closed shops can't happen for unions, and that people who don't want to join the union don't have to pay this fee for the union to service the contract, or in other words, to protect the rights of the worker as agreed to with the company on the job, right? And the thing of it is that because the economic barrier to expressing this choice of whether or not to have an abortion, it's impacted by whether or not women have access to health care. And there are a couple of things that unions absolutely do. They protect the workers' economic solvency, number one, and number two, the fact that we have employees with health insurance by and large is because unions have gone to the mat. And so that means if there's health insurance, that there's a female working class person that can afford and can have preventive reproductive services, etc., right, to even be able to access this right in the first place. Again, I don't want to downplay the importance of having the right to an abortion. But what right do you really have when you can't afford it in the first place? So why aren't Democrats and liberals talking about Janus, this ruling which upholds a woman's economic ability to even access this service in the first place, right? And here's the other thing. Because the core rationale for approving Roe v. Wade was based around privacy, then why aren't we talking about other forms of issues that are impacting our privacy? Why aren't we talking about the Patriot Act? Why aren't we talking about these expanded biometric scans and DNA tests and things like that for immigrants or for people that are being held in jails, right, who are in prison? And to the point that you don't even have to give consent if you're in prison. If they want to take DNA sample from you, they can take it from you, right? But we're not talking about those things. What we're responding to is this sort of liberal and this Democratic Party clarion call to make this big noise about this judicial appointee without even thinking about the fact that, one, not all women have access to these rights. Two, there's decisions that are absolutely impacting a woman's ability to pay for these services. And three, we're being inconsistent in our policies because we're not talking about some of these other things, right? And then even four, we need to have an honest conversation about what Democratic senators are doing in the Senate. Because I want to, recent history shows that Democrats unanimously approved Scalia, to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And we don't want to talk about that. We need to talk about who these 15 judicial appointments to the lower federal courts that the Democrats just rubber stamped and sent on through, and what that means to us in our daily lives. Because those federal lower court district judges have more impact on our lives than the Supreme Court actually does. The Supreme Court, at best, sees 80 to 100 cases a year. And if they don't all agree, if a number doesn't agree to even hear the case, they're just not going to hear the case. So those lower district courts have more impact on our daily lives than the Supreme Court actually does, right? So there's significant reason to be afraid of Kavanaugh and what he represents. But this is where the liberals and the Democrats in this country don't really have enough respect for you to let you know how things really, really work, right? We have to take it upon ourselves then to understand how SCOTUS works. And here's the spoiler that I was going to reveal until now. This decision in which Kavanaugh participated in whether or not this undocumented teen could have access to abortion, it was actually heard in the Supreme Court after the fact earlier this summer. And all of the Supreme Court justices unanimously upheld that this undocumented teen had no right to the abortion, even though they recognized that it was a moot point because she had already had it. Every single one of those Supreme Court judges voted to bar an undocumented person's right to have an abortion while they're in immigration detention. So now we're talking about working class women who really don't have access to abortion, and now we're talking about undocumented women who don't have access to an abortion. So really, who has the right to have an abortion? So I would encourage all of us to really think a little bit more deeply about these kinds of things. We've got a few things on our to-do list that we have to take care of instead of freaking out about Kavanaugh. Yes, we should be concerned about his politics, but we've also got to be concerned about the fact that the Supreme Court needs state law to deal with. They also need judicial lower court appointees to deal with, and they also need the approval of the Senate, the full Senate, right? So those three things are things that we need to work on instead of just simply feeling outrage about this Kavanaugh guy. I'm sorry, folks, but we have to stop abdicating our responsibility with this democracy. We have got to understand how this government works if we're going to be operating within it, and we need to take responsibility for the people who are making decisions that impact our daily lives. So that's my opinion about all that. I will post those links below so that you all can expand your knowledge if you're not aware of some of these issues. And thanks for watching yet again. We'll talk soon. Have a good day. Bye.